Hello and welcome to the Psych to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Paul Wagner, and it's just me today. However, I had two incredible guests on the show. Today we are talking to Dr. Robyn Walser and Dr. Darrah Westrup, and we had an opportunity to talk about their new book, You Are Not Your Trauma. For those of you who aren't familiar with Robyn or Darrah, both Dr. Robyn Walser and Darrah Westrup are internationally recognized experts in working with acceptance and commitment therapy as a treatment for trauma. They have 60 years combined experience working with many forms of trauma and its fallout, including severe PTSD, depression, anxiety, and other challenges. They have devoted their careers to helping people move beyond the pains of trauma and reclaim their lives. With this book, Robyn and Darrah offer their expertise, deep compassion, and fierce belief in the power to heal. That certainly comes across in the conversation. It was such an incredible opportunity to hear their experiences with really applying acceptance and commitment therapy to this population that fits so well. And I know I just walked away with a different perspective on utilizing ACT. And with that, we hope you enjoy this Masters in Practice episode, You Are Not Your Trauma. Thank you so much for joining us on the Psych to Practice podcast. Really happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
And so we're here today talking about your book, You Are Not Your Trauma, an ACT guide from healing from within. Here in the podcast, we really like to get an idea of what brought you into the field, and then also kind of hearing where the start of the idea for the book really came from.
Sure. I'll just start. Once I was in graduate school for psychology, and I had the opportunity to participate in what we called a vertical team, which was just students of various levels of the program. And then finally, our professor who was an expert in PTSD. And I will never forget the first person that I worked with their assistants watching and guiding behind a one-way window. And she was a woman who had been in just a horrific car accident. There were family members who had been killed, and she hadn't driven in, I think, something like 10 years. And she had a new spouse and new child that she could not take anywhere. And her life was just very small. And I got to see firsthand what exposure work, when done thoughtfully and carefully, can offer. I mean, she truly got her life back. And I was convinced at that point that this was a field that I wanted to be in, and I wanted to help people reclaim their lives after experiencing terrible things.
And that sounds like such a powerful introduction to PTSD. And I guess also curious, Robyn, how about for you? What brought you into the field?
Well, my story isn't nearly as, compelling. An undergraduate, I was heading into the field of medicine and wanted to be a medical doctor. And I was doing well in all of the sciences except chemistry. My chemistry was like really rough. And so it became clear to me at some point that I probably need to reconsider. And at the time I was running rats in a behavioral lab. And so I was basically putting rats on mazes and, learning about behaviorism and how animals learn and how we learn. And I just sort of stuck with it and started taking more psychology courses. And so eventually landed in the idea that I was going to do psychology. And I guess I could say that the rats got me here.
Yes, I think that's perfectly compelling.
In terms of trauma, I always had an interest in trauma and how trauma was impacting people's lives, and have a history of trauma myself. And so wanted to see how I assist others who might have had similar struggles. And so it just seemed like the two things got married up quite nicely.
I guess kind of hearing how both of you had this focus, how did you both come together to write the book?
To tell that story, can I tell that story? Yes. As soon as I left school, I had a career opportunity at the VA Palo Alto. to run the women's program there, the Women's Trauma Recovery Program, which was for military-related PTSD for female veterans. Very, very severe trauma, usually history of childhood trauma, and then military-related trauma. And it was quite an intensive program. And as soon as I got there, I started hearing about this Robyn Walser person, because I think perhaps I had expressed an interest in ACT. I'd had a dissertation that was ACT related, and I had gone to a workshop and I was talking about it, and everyone kept telling me, you've got to meet Robyn, who was at the National Center for PTSD. And we met, and boy, what a beginning of an amazing partnership. And we brought ACT into the residential treatment program. And it was the first time ever it had been in residential treatment. And that was in 2000.
And so with working together, like, what was that driving force to come together there for the book?
Well, so we wrote a book together in 2007, but that was, I think, as a result of Darrah and I's relationship. I mean, we were having fun. We were making a difference. We were enjoying doing what we were doing in the program, and an opportunity to write came up. And so the two of us decided to write a book that got released in 2007 on ACT and trauma. And we just had such a great time. Like, we holed up in a hotel at one point, and we were both writing till like 3:00 in the morning and passing chapters back and forth. And one would sleep while one would write, and one would write while one would sleep. And we finally finished up this book and popped open a big bottle of champagne when we finished it. But it was a really good experience. And we had the opportunity to write again, and said, hey, let's do it. And so wrote a second book.
Then the other piece is that first book was for other providers who were interested in bringing this therapy to their clientele. And this is for the layperson, aware of all the people that don't have access to treatment. And we really we saw such meaningful change. And it just drives us crazy to know that there's so many people out there that are alone or struggling and don't have assistance. And this is a way to reach them.
And I'm so grateful that you brought that up, that I find oftentimes in conversations working with others talking about like, oh, I have a partner who just won't come into therapy, or, that they don't think it's going to work. It's not for them. And certainly I think it's books like this that can be such a valuable bridge within the comfort of their own home, being able to really take it at their own pace. And I guess maybe as we're talking about the book, wanting to really make sure calling out the title of You Are Not Your Trauma. And that seems like such a significant theme throughout the book, and a crucial part of ACT and the approach that someone can take for their healing journey here.
Well, I'll say something, but Darrah may want to add to this as well, is that both of us are very interested in the part of ACT that is referred to as self as context, or perspective taking. And essentially what we're talking about here is that you are a place where memories, emotions, thoughts, sensation occur. You're an experiencer. You're not what you've experienced. You're not defined by an emotion. You are not defined by a thought. And part of what happens for trauma survivors is, and it makes sense because we're designed to try to keep ourselves safe, is that we get kind of locked into the trauma and what happened, and trying to stay safe becomes part of the way we move around in the world. So in some ways, the trauma can begin to define how you live and can take over. And so what we want to convey is that doesn't have to be the case. You do not have to be defined by your trauma, that you're much bigger than your trauma ever will be. And that if you can find a place where you are not your trauma, then you find freedom. And that's sort of the way Darrah and I think about it. And I don't know if you want to add to that, Darrah, but that's my take on it.
Well, we've talked so over so many late nights. This is the real gift of the therapy, in our opinion, this idea of being larger than, or whole and intact. And prior to ACT, I hadn't found a way to help someone that I was working with even consider that they might in fact be or not broken, even if they've had unfortunate histories where they've never, ever, ever been taught or told or shown that. And it's very hard. You can't just tell someone that they're acceptable. The first thing they do is check their experience to see. And that's not how it feels. This therapy provides a way to access that. And I'm with Robyn. I think it's the huge gift of the therapy and why we wanted to kind of shout it from our book cover. I picture someone walking by with this history and saying, "You're not your trauma." And I want that person to stop in their tracks. Right? Like, what?
And there's so many different examples in the book. And there's a few pieces I'm hoping to reference. We don't have to be governed by the thoughts and feelings. And in the same way, we can picture, the experience of standing up in a room and then walking around a room. But we don't actually go and engage in it. So we don't have to be defined by these moments or these actions or experiences, but rather being able to recognize and see and hold space for them without there being that judgment. And so we are not our experiences, I think, is certainly such a core message. And you are not your trauma goes along really well with that.
And it's very important to do it carefully. If you've ever heard anyone talk about Robyn in session, for instance, will talk about her compassion, like very bold, but incredibly compassionate. And it's so important to do this in a way that is validating, like that, you're actually not what your mind is telling you. And this suffering is so painful. We get that. So it's not you're not your trauma. It's, oh my gosh, we're going to join you in this painful place and help you hold this differently.
Yeah. And I'm curious, what was that experience like, trying to convey that from your experiences? Like, how challenging was that compassion? Because I hear the compassion is there, and there's so many different metaphors within the book and kind of uses of that sunset. Like, it's phenomenal. And I have to imagine just kind of the depth it takes to not only have the information, but presenting the information in a written tone that connects. What was that experience like?
Yeah, I do think that our voice in writing matters. And both Darrah and I worked hard to bring a voice to the book that is invitational and acknowledging and invites the person reading it into a very enlivening yet painful process. It's exploring some of your most painful experiences, but doing it from a place where you feel supported and safe. Both working with a voice inside of the book that we hope creates that for the readers, so that, almost as if they could hear us talking as a warm fire or a piece of wood that feels old and able to understand and connect, we want a voice that's in there that supports the work that they're doing. And so we actively work to bring that into the room.
Robyn, I wonder what you, pretty certain you'll agree that, to do act effectively as a provider, it's pretty important that you buy into it and embrace it yourself, and that you embody some of those ideas and ways of being in the therapy. And that was applied in the writing process. It's not like that was separated and now we're writing. We were in that same way of being as we wrote. And it's really nice to hear you say that you think that came across, because that certainly was the intention.
And I guess we should probably back up. We're using this term ACT, but for any of our listeners who might not be familiar with what ACT is, what is ACT and how is it being used in trauma to affect change and support others?
Well, so ACT stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. And we do say it is ACT. That's quite literal, because it is about action, but action with intention and awareness. And so part of what we're doing here is helping people to open up to their internal experience, be present to the emotions that they carry and have anyway, and then notice what you've learned in terms of what your mind has to offer you without it necessarily being the dictator of your behavior, because minds can seem to have a lot of power that we want to disempower them in the right context, right? So that you can take actions that are values-based, which is about the engaged part. So acceptance is opening up to, and then the engaged part has to do with living vitally according to your values and your meaning and purpose. And that all unfolds in the context of awareness. So we're going to help you build awareness to the here and now, to what you're experiencing, and awareness to, if I can say it this way, the there and then, where you want your feet to go, and what kind of life you want to build that has meaning and purpose and isn't defined by trauma. And so we think that ACT brings to trauma something that a lot of other therapies, although they're quite good, don't do, which is very specifically orienting people towards meaning and purpose in their life. So it's not just to do trauma treatment for the sake of reducing a symptom, let's say. It's let's do the work here to help you process this trauma in the service of something important, like where you want to head as you move forward in your life. So it's about expansion instead of contraction, broadening instead of shrinking in. And the work of being open and aware helps get you there. And so we think that it adds something to treatment, which is the typical treatment that people do to work on trauma. It's more about not just expose to expose, but why would you do this? Like, what is this all about? And you have this one short life to live. So let's create something that is meaningful to you in that process.
It's such an important piece of like the way that those beliefs are formed surrounding trauma and creating awareness, but really also that committed action step and the engagement, the experience, I guess also wanting to come in because the book, I think, that makes a very clear distinction with what trauma is and like everyday distress. I think trauma is a term that sometimes gets thrown around a bit too flippantly, and other times it's a term that gets avoided because we don't want to be associated with trauma. And so when you're talking about trauma in the book, like, what is that trauma that we're really talking about there?
We're talking about events where your physical well-being and safety, that of someone that you love or that you're witnessing, is in total jeopardy. Yeah. So you're right that trauma as a term is bandied about to refer to really anything difficult or challenging. And we recognize that those things exist. But when it comes to what the focus of this book is, we're really talking about those sort of catastrophic events that are life-changing.
Yeah. So it would be, childhood sexual and physical abuse, war trauma, vehicular accidents, refugee trauma, all of the different fires, threat to life, threat to integrity, like those are the kinds of things we're thinking about. And that can be complex trauma, like ongoing and longstanding exposure to traumatic events in childhood per se, but it can also be a single event, like a car accident or an earthquake, natural disasters. So, we're covering the gamut here, but it's about threat to integrity. I'm kind of on a personal mission to reclaim the word trauma because, I'll hear it these days, like my mom took my phone away and I was traumatized forever. So it does get bandied about in ways that are not threats to your integrity. And I think even clinicians sometimes get confused about how they're thinking about what's traumatic and what's just emotionally painful, so I think it's good to get that clarification out there.
I think that's such an important distinction, and clinicians being able to communicate that while still holding space for the distressing events that occur throughout our life and throughout our days, but we can differentiate that, and that doesn't diminish those distressing events. It just adds that clarity. And kind of going through the books, I noticed like these three different stages. The first one being surrounding like the safety and skill building, then being able to talk about planned exposure, and then reconnection. So could you describe what the purpose and progression of those stages are?
Yeah, so it's based on Judith Herman's 3 stages of trauma healing. There's been an argument in the field for a while about whether you need to go through the stages or you can just put people right into exposure. And we sort of think it's both, that some people are ready to do exposure right away, but there's a fair number of people who there's high dropout in exposure. There's people who just refuse to do exposure because They're afraid of doing it, and they need more safety and stabilization first, and some skills to work with the trauma that they're experiencing. We want to invite people to walk through the process of processing their trauma in such a way that it doesn't have to turn into a failure because they got thrown into the exposure and they just avoid. Like, avoidance is what this is about, right? And so we want to invite people into a place where avoidance is addressed and worked with in a safe and skills-based way, so that then when we come to processing the trauma, they're ready for it. And not that somebody couldn't do that. And there's certainly research that shows that people can do exposure right up front and do well. But Darrah and I have years and years and years of experience of people saying, no, thank you. I need other things first. And so we're trying to be comprehensive in that. And then once you've done the exposure, like, let's come back into a space where you're reconnected to the here and now, because that exposure is focused on what happened, right? And that you're now building and moving forward and growing and engaging again. Now that you've come to a place where you are not your trauma and you've processed the emotional experience of it, that you can connect and move forward in ways that you find personally meaningful.
I would add that I did have this lovely opportunity of directly being able to compare in this residential program, because we were doing exposure prior to bringing ACT in. And then I got to see what happened when we did exposure after bringing ACT in. And there's such a beautiful marriage between what ACT offers skill-wise and what's required for exposure to be successful. And in a way, it gives the individual something to really stand on. And this ability to step in to the exposure process in a real stance of power and intention and willingness. We just saw amazing differences when the two were combined in that way.
And I just have to say, like, the way that both of you talk about the use of ACT, and I can visualize that it creates that empowerment, it creates that willingness. I'm wanting to maybe talk about this piece that I believe the book really references, is that psychological flexibility, and hearing that ability to create distance from the experience while still being able to get that exposure from it. What does the concept of psychological flexibility really entail when you're sharing it with others?
Well, one thing that helps me is really understanding that this isn't about a concept, or it's not about information transfer. We're talking about ways of being.
Yeah.
And so to help people arrive at psychological flexibility, which is just a way of being, a way of working with what shows up in life, the events that occur and our responses to them and all of that, in a way that allows us to remain engaged and present and focused on what matters to us, even with the difficulties that come. And that you can hear in that. That's all skills. And so to arrive there, we are helping those we work with develop all the different abilities that go into psychological flexibility. And it's a journey, and it's a little bit on a continuum. We move around on these abilities, but together they make psychological flexibility.
I'll add a little bit maybe here too. When I think about this, is that, we're unique as critters on the face of this earth in this sense, is that we have the ability to imagine, think. We can language, basically. And what I mean by that is we're speaking individuals, and we're doing it with ourselves all the time. And part of what happens for us as human beings is that we lose contact with something really important inside of this kind of very mindy space that we spend most of our time. Language itself, like we're constantly languaging, and I'm equaling that to mind. But we learn in different ways. And one of the things that happens to us is that we move away from what's referred to as experiential learning, which is a way of encountering the world that isn't necessarily about what you know with your head, but more about, if I can say it this way, what you know with your heart and your body. One quick example is that you don't learn to walk as a baby by somebody telling you how to do it. You do it by moving around and encountering the world. And so that way of learning is really important. But as you develop your mind and you learn more through your mind, you get on rules and social constructions and messages from your parents and messages from your friends. And a lot of those messages are things like this. You shouldn't feel, and you shouldn't feel bad. And
something's wrong with you if you're feeling bad.
Yeah, that you're not okay. And so language or minds coming together in a social way make rules that don't speak to what we know experientially. And what we know experientially is that no emotion is permanent, no thought is permanent, no sensation is permanent, that they rise and fall. And that when we get inside of this very mindy process, rule-bound space, our lives get constricted, they get less flexible. They become more rigid and like a dried out stick. We got to follow the rule. And what we're trying to do is bring people back to experiential knowledge, relating to their mind a little bit more with more freedom so that they aren't caught in one way of knowing the world. And it's too rigid. And so psychological flexibility here is about experiencing yourself as more than just your mind and being able to respond to your mind rather than being the victim of your mind, if that's a good way of saying it.
And is that really also kind of captured by that idea or the concept of the self as context or the noticer? Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, you've got it.
Yeah. And when we are in that state, how does that empower individuals to hold their experiences and not feeling defined by that?
Well, you no longer have to rigidly follow rules. You can see them rise and fall, and you can choose. So you can orient towards meaning and purpose versus being sort of out of self as context and I am my mind versus you are a person who has a mind. And so we're helping them see that they have a mind. And if you have a mind, then you're free from it. You carry it instead of it carrying you. And so inside of that space, choice is more available. And when choice is more available, then we can pick things in our lives that build meaning rather than running all the time and seeking safety all the time. Because a lot of folks who are traumatized, right? Like safety is top priority, but it also means I can't do this and I shouldn't do that and I can't go there and I can't see this person. Like it's limiting. The rules of safety limit. And so what we want to do is make the rules something you can choose to do or not.
One of the insights that is gained from the therapy, Robyn, you've said this, just another way to say it is realizing that thoughts and feelings aren't in charge. And there's a huge freedom to that. And there's also there go my reasons. There go like I'm squarely on the hook. If I'm not my history and my thoughts and feelings aren't actually in charge, and even my mind can do whatever, what's next? What will I do? And that's where that third part of the book comes in around valued living, and we get to create meaning in our life and make choices that are in line with that.
That's exactly where kind of I wanted to go. And I made note of the committed action piece. And really, I hear that as the step of once there's that willingness to experience the discomfort, being able to engage in that committed action. Can you elaborate a little bit more on kind of how that can be used kind of to help propel or maybe even as a compass for individuals once they've experienced that moment and being able to give some direction?
Well, so, we're behaving organisms, and when we're not captured by our thoughts or captured by our emotional states, we can move. And one of the things that I love to say is live your life from the feet up, because we are so busy in the head that we live it from the head down. And in that space, we lose our meaning. We're like doing things that are not about how we want to live. And so part of what we're doing here with committed action is life from the feet up. What behaviors are you going to engage to bring your values to life? Because you can have a value, let's say, of being loving. That can be your value, and not do anything about it at all. You can say, I have this value and it's really important to me, and not engage it. And so committed action is an intentional, aware, I am going to take this action, this behavior linked to my value in the service of me building a life worth living. And so those behavioral pieces are just as important as the acceptance pieces. So we want people living life from the feet up, so to speak, stepping forward in recognizing that it's challenging, like there's difficulties and barriers, and like we're not dismissing those things at all. But it's one of the things that Darrah's heard me say, and I've said this to a client where he said something like this, but trauma ruined me. And he was a Vietnam veteran, and the VA stole my life, right? Like this whole experience ruined me and stole my life. And there's truth in that, right? Like as a veteran, a Vietnam era veteran, when he came back from war, the government wasn't there for him. And he saw some terrible, and had some terrible experiences in Vietnam. He'd been saying that for years and years and years. And I said, what's going to happen if you say it one more time? And the answer was nothing.
Yeah.
But it's not to invalidate his experience. Those things happened and they were painful and important. But something has to move as you step forward. And so where will you put your feet? And that's where that committed action piece becomes so important. I don't know if you would add to that, Darrah. But
what often happens is I just have images of people that I've worked with and their experiences here. You're bringing to mind some of the veterans that you and I both worked with, and thinking about what seemed to me particularly precious about values as viewed in act is how inviolable they are. Just as it doesn't matter, you can hold a value if it doesn't swing into action in some way, oh well. But so too is values always there and always accessible. So if you've never had an honest day in your life and decide that you value honesty, that's available to you. It's not constrained by your history. And I'm thinking of veterans that we worked with who felt that they no longer deserved to be about love or kindness or even faith because of what they'd seen and done. And for them to realize it's right, you in this next moment, you have every opportunity to honor that value, to claim it.
A tragedy unfolded, but there's another tragedy that could unfold.
Yeah.
And that's if you don't claim it.
Yeah.
And so we want to invite people into not continuing the tragedy and claiming that space, I think, is really important.
And well, I think it would be inaccurate to say that making it sound easy, but I have to imagine talking about this is far easier than the actual practice, and especially the experience that the individuals go through and the bravery that's required, the trust if they are in the therapy setting, reflection, and the willingness to take that leap of faith if they're just kind of at home reading the book. And I think the book does a good job of also giving some different ideas of when those thoughts arise, because I think when we are in a safe environment and we're reading through it, and we can really kind of we can feel empowered, but when we are out and there's maybe those natural exposures or some of those moments, it can be really challenging to have these at hand. And I believe the book refers to them as some defusion techniques. And would you mind kind of sharing what defusion techniques are, and maybe a few of them that can be effectively used to help try to challenge and bring this really that thought of you or not your thoughts back to awareness?
It's a tricky one, because the more fused someone is with their hot thoughts, the more difficult it is to help them view that thought process differently. But fortunately, there are a number of ways to do it, ranging from metaphors and experiential exercises. One that's in mind, because I did it about an hour ago, is helping someone who very wedded to thoughts, very intelligent, very used to putting all of the credit and weight into the thought process, and had this person take out a whole bunch of index cards and work through an experience that she was having that was just extremely painful, and walking through what's the first thought that you noticed, and the next, and the next, and then what was happening in your body, and then what emotions showed up, and then just kind of generating a number of these. And what we're doing there is physically creating a distance by putting them out there, practicing on noticing, And then just kind of talking about it and kind of looking at, you can't see me if you're just listening, but I'm physically kind of adjusting my body. So I'm looking at these with her. We're looking at them together, observing, and yet being really joining in the pain of it. Like, oh my gosh, I feel so heavy. Are you what is that like? What showed up next? And then just looking at it together for a bit, and then suggesting that we put them in some sort of order. And then coming up, asking are you a book person or a music person or a movie person? And then she was a song person. So let's give this a title. And that kind of described the kind of song it was. And she's just tasked with noticing. There's nothing, she doesn't need to be different here. She doesn't have to have different thoughts, all she needs to do is get really good right now at noticing when her song, and then do a check. I've asked her to do a check on her emotional experiences because that's hard. And what I'm hoping is she'll just get very good at noticing and being able to say, there it is. And it'll expand from there.
Fusion if you think of fusion as a gluing together, I am my mind. Defusion is a process of ungluing. You have a mind. Like, think about babies, right? Like, a little baby isn't thinking, gosh, I wish mom would come and pick me up out of the crib and I'm wet, whatever. Babies aren't having those thoughts. We learn to think. We get a mind. You were there before your mind was. And so what we're helping people see is that you do not have to be your mind. You have one. It goes with you wherever you go. And just like your blood runs through your body, thoughts run through your mind. It's an ongoing, flowing process that you can come to observe. In this card exercise that Darrah is explaining, like, you can come to observe this rather than be it. And so we're helping people defuse or unglue from their minds.
I love the way you were talking about the note cards there, Darrah, because it's the thoughts and also the emotions as well, and kind of putting a physical manifestation to each, creating that timeline. But we then just get to listen to the song that is being played, and the song will end. And I recognize that fear and hopelessness are two of the biggest barriers to individuals taking these steps. How does this approach overcome some of those barriers?
Because I think, Robyn, see if this is how you view it. I think that we went with the book similarly like we in session, which is begin by joining and sending a strong message of the importance of the struggle that is going on. The pain of it matters, and that we're here to understand that as fully as we can and to help find a place to hold that together. Like, we kind of start there in the way that we introduce the book, and then we move through together the skills that are going to help people work with this differently. What would you add, Robyn?
I think we both would agree that, stepping out of the safety zone involves some risk. Like, you might try something new and it doesn't work, or you might have an experience where you feel scared again, right? Like, these kinds of things are happening in life. And so we agree with something you said earlier, that in some ways it's a leap of faith. But the way we want to think about it here is that if your life has been captured by the trauma, things feel small and unattainable, you feel caged, so to speak, by the need to stay safe, then it's very hard to build meaning in that space. And so what we want to offer here is that, yeah, it might be scary, and we can feel that, like that barrier being part of why you might not want to do something, and that you're hoping for something. And the only way you can discover it is by taking the leap. And so there's some risk here, but you've got a life that's sort of small and captured by trauma, or a life where there's some risk, and sometimes it's going to work fabulously and sometimes maybe not. But if you have a year worth of risk or a year worth of nothing, which year do you pick?
Yeah.
And so we're inviting people into some risk taking for sure. We don't want them to ever be traumatized again, right? Like, that's not what we're saying. But if you're going to go out and fall in love, that's risky, because you might be rejected. Or if you're going to trust people again, that's risky, because some people are not going to be trustworthy, right? But it's either don't trust anybody ever, or try and trust again and see what happens. Those are two different kinds of life. And we're voting for the one where you can get out there and taste all the different things that are on the menu instead of just staying away from the food completely, if that makes sense.
Actually, I think this was the way that Darrah described your approach, Robyn, of like bold but compassionate.
Yes.
And I hear that here where the compassion is necessary, because if we're coming in, there is fear, there's self-blame, but the compassion shows that there's that understanding, while also the subtle empowering that comes louder and louder to this healthy risk-taking and, again, having that life worth living.
It's a little bit like yes, and
improv in there as well. Absolutely. Yes. And there's maybe one more piece of the book before we start pulling back here. I just wanted to ask about the idea of like maintaining long-term healing, and what does that look like for individuals that have gone through this process, that have found success with it, and might be exposed to other barriers, might be exposed to different events that are triggering for them. Really, how do you identify what maintaining long-term healing is for individuals that are using the book here?
I'm curious how you'd answer that, Robyn. I'll just say that these skills aren't fleeting. They're hard-earned. And once you have them, they're yours. And so what I've found is that, yes, life continues to be life, but now people have this way of working with that's so empowering, and it stays, right? So we can easily fall into old patterns and find ourselves buying our thoughts again and all that. In fact, we expect that. But the key is to bring that noticing, awareness, and contact the present fully. Notice the thought process, make room for the emotions, get clear on your values and what in the next moment you might do that's in the service for those. Like, those abilities aren't going anywhere. So like anything, practice. The more you practice, the stronger these get. But it's a lasting sort of ability that we're building up.
I would just add that ACT is a lifelong practice, not an outcome.
Yes.
You don't arrive at acceptance. You practice accepting, and you don't arrive at present moment. You practice being in the moment. And so all of these are, as Darrah said, lifelong practices. And so, of course, when we practice, sometimes we forget to practice. The thing is, then, if you find yourself falling off the path, you can say, okay, I told you so. I guess this wasn't going to work. Or you step back on the path. And the goal of the practice here is to step back on the path.
And, I feel like we could keep talking about the book for hours, but I know we're on a bit of a time. So, maybe as we're starting to pull back, one thing we like to ask our guests is if you could both recommend one piece of content, could be a book, movie, TV show, for those in the profession, what would you recommend?
I think I would recommend The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, a Jim Carrey movie, right, where he loses his girlfriend and he wants to have her erased. And as he has her erased, he realizes what he's losing. And so, what does it mean to erase ourselves of our emotions and our thoughts and our experiences? There's a cost to that. And so I think and I love the title, The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And you have to get a spotless mind in order to get that eternal sunshine. And I don't know anybody who has that, but I think that would be the movie that I would recommend.
Great choice.
I'm going to go with the movie too, because I love to use movies as metaphors in my work. Boy, I'm going to go with Good Will Hunting and thinking about trauma. And here we have the protagonist who, horrific childhood abuse, who has an exceptional mind, is all mind. That's his value, is his mind. And self-concept just devastating. And that moment in the movie where with Robin Williams' help, he's able to see, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And that moment that he's not this learning that he's had all this time. And really, hope I'm not spoiling anything, but to discover he's not even his mind. He's more than that. And getting in touch with his values in just this beautiful way. Yeah, I love that movie.
And I think I know what I'm going to be doing with my weekend is going and rewatching these classics with a new focus here. And one other thing we like to ask is, if each of you could provide maybe one gem or one takeaway from your experience in the field that you think would be valuable to pass on to our listeners, what's one thing that you think would be helpful or valuable for them to hear or know?
One thing, I really think that, what draws me to this work, I think more broadly, is that as far as I know, we have this one life to live and it goes by so quickly. What I would want for people is to be in that life fully, wholly, with, if I can be bold, love. And that to do that, it means we got to show up. And so my hope for people is them to really recognize the preciousness of life and time passing, and that if you've got this one life, what will you make it look like? And I think that's an important message for me to convey to others and in the work I do.
I'm just thinking about how being human is such a funny business, and how, we have these very human abilities that cause us so much suffering and self-torture. Right. And then we can use those same abilities. We can decide what we care about, for example, and we can intentionally choose. We have the same abilities to actually create the lives that we want to be living, to be in the world in a way that is authentic and meaningful to us. That's an incredible capacity. And so I kind of like, Robyn, our two messages together, show up. And there's no limit.
I just want to say thank you so much, both Darrah and Robyn, for joining us today. And, certainly hoping our audience checks out your book, You Are Not Your Trauma, an ACT Guide to Healing from Within. If our audience is interested in staying up to date with what's going on for you, or is there any areas they can go to follow to hear kind of what you're up to?
On the website, robynwalser.com, and people can sign up for my newsletter there and follow the work that I'm doing and trainings I'm providing from that website. I'm on Instagram and I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Facebook, all those places, right? Yes. And so I love to have people come along and comment and react and be a part of the community that Darrah and I are a part of.
Yes, likewise. My website is drdarrah.com and my LinkedIn is Darrah Westrup, Twitter Dr. Darrah, Instagram Dr. Darrah. You'll find me there. And I just really thank you for the opportunity to talk about such a meaningful topic with one of my favorite people. And if you're listening, I really, just appreciate the time that you've spent with us.
Thank you, Paul, for inviting us on the show.
Thank you both for coming. And it's been such a pleasure. And again, if you're interested in checking out Darrah and Robyn's book, You Are Not Your Trauma, an ACT Guide for Healing from Within, check out the show notes. There will be a link to purchase there, as well as posted on our social media page as a separate post. If you're a licensed clinician who would like to use this information, please head over to www.psych2practice.com or check the show notes for a link to purchase the accompanying exam for continuing education units for this episode. If you are interested in hearing more or staying up to date with what's going on for Psych2Practice, you can visit our website or follow us on all major social media by searching Psych2Practice. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but until then, be well, stay psyched.